Leo Wang, founder and CEO of Lucius. Great to have you on the show.
So happy to be here, Wilfred. Thanks for having me.
Cool, we've got a tight agenda, so let's get straight into things. Let's have a bit of a conversation about content creation in the Earth observation space. I understand you've done a bit yourself. I'm sitting here on this podcast doing content creation as well, so yeah, all ears for your experiences and advice you might have.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I'll start off with a quick intro on myself and my business and why it's potentially interesting to listen to this conversation. So my name's Leo. I grew up in the DC area, went to school at USC in California, and then moved to Berlin right after college. Have been in Berlin for almost 10 years. My first 5 years in SaaS sales, my last 5 years in geospatial. During my time in geospatial, I was working at a marketplace reseller distributing, working mostly on the commercial side and have sold a lot of satellite imagery. So that's where I'd say I cut my teeth. And during that time, I learned a lot about remote sensing. And so what we're trying to do at Lucius is really help vendors and help satellite operators with solutions to help them sell and manage order requests from their customers. So we really have the belief that there's going to be more satellite operators moving forward. There's going to be more resellers. There's going to be more data sets. And it's not about everyone building the same tools over and over again to manage those orders and resell that data, but to allow essentially create, let's say, tools, a platform in intermediary space within the industry to support these businesses in selling data. You mentioned talking about content creation. Yeah, I mean, I think my first thoughts on content creation are that a, it on when you're 2 years into it, you're suddenly this kind of, person who's known for doing content creation. But when you start on it, you're just as, new and just as a beginner on anything. So I actually started creating content, I would say beginning of 2023, mostly around sales, right? And really my initial goal was let's just post a lot, post every day about anything. And really the goal with that was don't be afraid to post, right? Don't be afraid to share what you think, share your voice. And so over a year, I was mostly posting on sales, sharing my experience moving into a management role, that kind of stuff, more personal stuff. And then in end of 2023, when I started Lucius, I was thinking, well, look, I've built up this kind of ability to post and share my voice on LinkedIn. Why don't I talk about, things related to remote sensing and see if I can drive some interest, maybe offer some of the insights that I gained working at a marketplace, working at a reseller, share some what I would hope to be like an inside scoop and share some, like, let's say, not as uh not as like, bold predictions, but more pragmatic perspectives on the industry and see, what happens on LinkedIn and hope that the symptom of that is driving eyes on my business, Lucius, and driving interest to the website, right? So I would say the first point is content creation is a muscle, and the first thing, and it's a habit, and the first thing that you should do is focus on building that habit. Now, looking at, I think I'm going a little further, going in more specifically into the remote sensing space. I think the biggest takeaway is that I mean, if we're saying in the space industry that there's a lot of opportunity in space, we're very optimistic about the industry as a whole. That translates even further into remote sensing from a content perspective. I think that there are so many unheard voices in this industry with so much perspective that, that perspective doesn't come out unless you're in, sitting across from them and they're sharing their views to you in person at some kind of event or at some kind of, or not even in the talks, right? Mostly one-on-one, right? Because,
Yeah,
when you hear
or on this
talks.
podcast.
Exactly, or on podcasts, right? When someone asks you directly. But yeah, exactly. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in terms of content creation. I think that in general, like there's a lot of things that the space industry does that's cutting edge, and there's a lot of stuff that we do that's, I would say, lagging behind, right? So, a lot of other industries have adopted content creation to the point where it's, saturated. We're not even close. We're just starting, right? And that's why, you know, I felt like when I started posting stuff about, my thoughts, the interest was very fast, and there was a lot of appetite for it in the space. So I guess I'd be my takeaway for everyone is, I'm sure you have a voice, say something, post it, share it, because there's a lot of people who are interested.
Yeah, you mentioned sharing, I guess, your personal story, I guess, about your career progression. I understand you spent some time at Up 42, so that management role that you were talking about, was that achieved at Up 42?
Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
I was in a IC sales executive, account executive, sales manager role for 3 years. And then in my last year, I moved into a team lead position. So yeah, I mean, I started off really just kind of sharing like my experience moving into that kind of role, what I found worked, what I found didn't,
Yeah.
thoughts. I mean, it was an experience where, I'd have conversations with my team members and then I'd be like, oh, I should write about that. I write
Mhm.
about that the next day. So I think they were, they found it funny because, we'd have a conversation and they'd be like, oh, boom, next day Leo's posted about it. Uh,
They might have felt like guinea pigs.
yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly.
So this was all on LinkedIn. That was your main so-called content sharing or creation platform?
Yeah, exactly. Honestly, I don't really know why I picked LinkedIn, but I did, and I've been very happy that I have. I mean, yeah, I think that you bring up a good point there too as well, which is, where's the medium? I think LinkedIn. I mean, my experience of it is it's very positive. I mean, it has its own tendencies as well, right? It definitely accentuates and exaggerates certain types of content, as do all mediums. But I think in general, it's positive, and there's a lot more eyes than you would think. There's a lot of people scrolling on LinkedIn that, you would never you never catch people on the train or anything. You never look at their phone and see them scrolling through LinkedIn, but there are a lot of eyes on LinkedIn, so
Right.
that's my experience, and
Yeah.
you can really target it, and that community feels really kind of accessible there.
Yeah, I mean, it's running a podcast. I've kind of just recorded the episodes, published them, and trusted that people looking at them, let them take it from there if you like. The publishing event is as far as my promotions go. Um, and yeah, I've basically I used Twitter, then I switched over to Bluesky. I've been using LinkedIn, I guess, for at least a year now. What else? I've never tried Facebook. I did briefly go onto TikTok, but I was honestly pretty horrified with what I saw. Um, but I also tried Threads. That really didn't work very well. But it's interesting how on each of these platforms there is a little ecosystem of geospatial and Earth observation. And there was a woman, I forget her name, um, on TikTok who shared, I don't know, almost daily content, little short videos of sort of inspirational, like you were saying, things that she confronted at work, things like that. And there was a strong personal element. Um, it's interesting how I guess there's a different type of content, perhaps the length of it, the topics covered that work on different platforms.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Look, I'm not gonna act like I know any. I mean, I scroll through Instagram, and that's and YouTube, right? So those are really kind of like my social
Yeah.
platforms that I scroll, and LinkedIn, right? I scroll through a lot of LinkedIn, just having, being someone who posts on it, and just trying to get a gauge. I think in general, I have a lot to learn in this space as well. In a lot of ways, I've only I started off just posting, and then it always takes like an emotional leap to say, oh, should I start posting a photo, or should I start posting, these carousels, right? And then one day you do it, and then you do it five times, 10 times, and then you're like, okay, now I can post carousels, right? Now I'm not afraid of posting carousels. And then the next time you like record a, short video, and then you post that once, and you're like, okay, now I've done it. Like, does that work? And so on. Or do I post diagrams, right? Recently I started using essentially just taking old posts, converting them into diagrams, and trying to make them a little more easily consumable, because a lot of the content I write is sprawling essays that get really close to the limit, and sometimes I look at it and I'm like, would I read that? Probably not, but I'm lucky and happy that people spend the time to listen to the
Yeah.
ramblings that come out in
Yeah,
purely
I was going to
word.
say I
Right.
came up against the character limit on comments on LinkedIn over the past few days. Somehow I got into a discussion with my old master's professor in Melbourne, in Australia, just actually carrying on a thread that Matt Forrest started about the quality of undergraduate geospatial education, the fact there's not enough Python or SQL. And yeah, inevitably, I had some reflections to share. So I guess it wasn't necessarily deliberate, but I did get into a personal content creation there, reflecting on, yeah, the quality of my education.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. I mean, I think that if I had to kind of distill what I mean, and you see this all over social media as a whole, right? I think there's appetite for genuine, authentic content, right? And that's really easy to say. If I had to really kind of think through what that meant, it's content that feels like it has a personal voice to it, right? That it's not just even like very informative things can be delivered in a way that feels less, how would you say it, like um less sterile, right? So, I mean, you can really make that comparison easily, right? You can see very quickly when something is AI generated, right? It has a certain formatting, and it has a certain way that sounds, not really like someone typed it out and wrote it out and felt that way themselves, right? It's like an amalgamation of just information distilled and summarized in a certain way, right? And I think what people really like attach to and connect with, at least what I found on LinkedIn, is content that, albeit, may be flawed, right? Maybe misguided, maybe wrong, maybe overly emotional in some ways. They're more, connected with that kind of content than more like, let's say, sterile summaries, or just very blatant corporate marketing, right?
Yeah.
Corporate marketing is is not. I don't think that's LinkedIn anymore. I think LinkedIn has moved on and progressed into more voices.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, great to have a distillation there. Maybe what we could do is carry that through to your commentary on imagery, sales, and marketplaces, and perhaps some examples of successes there, and how content creation perhaps accompanied those efforts.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so what we're trying to do at Lucius is essentially take the value proposition of imagery marketplaces and sell that to existing organizations, as well as new resellers. Existing resellers and new satellite operators who are coming into the fold and saying, "Hey, you don't have to build your own, ordering interface and order management software. You can just buy that from us. We can configure it to match your brand. We can, give you the tools to connect your archive and make it really easy for your customers to query your existing archives, query archives from the suppliers you represent, as well as then manage those orders on the back end, right? Administratively, or for your sales team to have those tools to handle and manage those orders, and track those orders, right? So that's kind of the perspective that I'm coming from, right? Having worked at an imagery marketplace in the past, right? So in terms of, why we started doing that, and also, some commentary on the marketplaces as a whole. So I think the value and and let's say like the North Star, the ethos around marketplaces is that ordering imagery should be much easier, right? So I agree. I agree with that completely, right? I mean, if you compare it to, worlds, one with only ordering via email and, placing phone calls and getting text, or the world with ordering platforms and APIs, definitely lean towards a world of ordering platforms and APIs, right? But I think the challenge of imagery marketplaces, and what they find is that a lot of the power still, is held by the supplier, right? This essentially, imagery marketplaces very rarely offer additional capabilities on top of what the supplier already offers, right? So if the supplier doesn't make it possible for you to get automated feasibility, the reseller is not going to be able to replicate that capability on their platform, right? So in that sense, marketplaces are always a time lag in capability between on their platform with the supplier itself, right? So to make that simpler, the marketplace cannot offer something that very rarely offers a capability that the supplier doesn't already offer themselves. Number two, I think one of the big challenges that you find as let's say, a generic imagery reseller or a global marketplace is that that's actually what comes off, and what seems like an advantage, which is like, oh, we can sell globally, becomes your Achilles heel, right? So where you see what you saw in the business historically is that these resellers popped up from two based off of two kind of core additional value propositions, right? One, which is geographical, right? Let's say you're Airbus, let's say you're Maxar, you want to sell to every country in the world, but you can't speak, Arabic, or you can't speak Hindi, or you can't speak or Russian, or whatever, right? You go to a reseller who will then act as your extension in those countries, who can, shake hands with those potential government officials, or shake hands with potential businesses in that region, speak that language, and sell on your behalf, right? That reseller in those countries have that advantage of being able to speak the language, being geographically located in that region, right? So, they can offer something in the sales process, and essentially work from a sales perspective there. The second point is value-added services on top, right? So a reseller may say, hey, I can resell imagery, but I can also, do this, vessel detection, or I can do, vegetation management on top, right? I can offer an additional service on top, and then leverage the imagery. The reselling part is just essentially an operational tool internally to increase my margin, right? So those are what I would say core product-based value propositions, right? I mean, product being, I'm located in this region, part of the service, right? Where these imagery marketplaces have a challenge is that they're not necessarily advantaged in either of those ways, right? They're purely focused on reselling imagery, and then simultaneously they have a global presence, but global being a master of none, right? Competing against geographically located resellers who have that advantage. So what we're trying to do essentially is say, hey, you know, these guys have gotten the ordering platform piece right. It should be easier to order imagery. Let us build this platform, ordering interface and order management solution out of the box. And hey, existing reseller with millions of dollars in books of business and recurring revenue in this year in Brazil and in Canada and in Kazakhstan and in India, you don't have to rebuild this ordering platform. You can just pay a subscription fee to us. We'll configure it to your needs. And now you have an ordering platform as well that is modern and fits the expectations of a 21st century space organization, space and technology organization.
Yeah. Okay. So I can link this to, in terms of guest coverage on this podcast, Skyfi. So I guess what listeners could have in their minds is that instead of having to build something like the impressive platform that is Skyfi, and I presume there's a few $1 million that have gone into that, they can come to you and skip that development step. So I have to ask, because in the past week there's been a bit of buzz on LinkedIn, funnily enough, in terms of their content creation, of an integration somehow with Planet. So has that been of interest, that development in this industry of yours?
I guess I'm not 100% sure where to start with. So, I mean, I think Skyfi is a great example of an imagery marketplace. I mean, you have to mention the existing ones, Up 42,
Yeah.
Skywatch as well. Our Lula did some of that as well. Before that, there was a company, Australia, that got acquired. So, I mean, I
Oh,
would
what
say,
was
and
that
then
one?
there's
I'm from Australia. I always have an interest in
no,
Australia.
no, the company was called Australia, but
Oh, really?
our Lula is from Australia. But anyways, I mean, there's new businesses popping up as well. Another one that we're seeing is a company based off of India, I think called Earth Eye as well. It's trying to do something similar. So I mean, I would say the idea isn't, I would not I would not limit it to only Skyfi is tackling this, but I think what
Yeah.
Skyfi has done is doing a great job of promoting themselves and really marketing themselves and kind of establishing themselves so that when people talk about this, people talk about them, right? So I think they're doing a great job there. In terms of the Planet integration, I don't know exactly the details of it, right? I've looked into it a little further. It looks like they're essentially offering the ability for customers to be able to decide which paths they want to request from the platform directly, right? Which is to be clear, a capability that a lot of the SAR providers have made possible for years, right? Capella's
Okay.
made that possible for years. Umbra's made that possible for years, right? So and also to clarify as well, I haven't looked into the Planet platform yet, so I can't necessarily make this claim. My assumption is that Planet has made APIs or it already possible within their interface to execute such an action, right? So
It's
I
great to
mean,
have a
I'm
bit
not
of critical thinking from someone within the industry.
right. So I mean, I'm not discounting the capability. I think the capability is great, and it's exactly what the industry wants, right? The industry wants to be able to like have some kind of sense for whether I can capture this image and know kind of when I can request it, rather than say, hey, here's a 2 week window. I'll take it any day. Can I get it within that time frame? And then waiting 2 days to figure out whether it's possible or not, and then it not showing up after 2 weeks, right? So that's that's my take on it. But I mean, I think again, I would I don't know the details, right? But my assumption is that Planet has this capability already, right?
Mm, mm.
Which is why as an external developer on top of Planet, this Skyfi is able to offer this. Now, granted, I haven't looked into it. Maybe they've organized it in such a way that Skyfi is releasing this capability on top of an API, and Planet doesn't have this capability within their platform, right? In which case, that's a great innovation from a platform perspective. But again, it's only possible because Planet exposes an API to be able to execute this.
Yeah. So, forgive me for trafficking in cliches, but what you just described about a window of 2 weeks and being uncertain if the imagery would even be captured on the date that you were hoping it might be captured and having to wait a significant length of time to see that. The phrase that sprang to mind for me is that the platform that you're standing up and others competitors that you talked about is basically trying to be the Uber for satellite imagery.
Yeah, so to clarify, what we're doing is what I would say is like I mean we're very different than Skyfi. I really want to establish that we're different from Skyfi. We're different from Up 42. What we're doing is not setting up an image marketplace. We are essentially building a off-the-shelf ordering platform, front end and order management back end, and saying, hey, we can brand this as a reseller or as a satellite operator. We can brand this and quickly set it up so that you as a business now have your own ordering platform that you can provide for your customers,
Right.
right? So I think that's very different because what we do is we sell software. right? What
Yep.
other what they do and what most imagery marketplaces do is they sell pixels. They take a
Gotcha.
margin on sales, right? So they make money by selling imagery, which is
Mm.
what I used to do. I used to sell imagery. What
Yeah.
we do now is we sell software.
Okay. So, does a function of your software offer the average user of it? So, for me, if I'm working at an engineering consultancy trying to get a high res image of the proposed railway route, um, does your software include time estimates for when the image might be captured, delivered, and things like that, or is it usually deployed against an archive of existing imagery, and
Yeah,
so
so I
those
mean those
estimates don't matter?
Yeah, so I mean, those two are kind of what we consider like two different aspects of ordering, right? One, which is like an existing archive of imagery that can easily be queried and easily be requested, and maybe have some additional processing requested on top,
Yep.
right? The other piece, which I think you're leaning into, is the around requesting imagery and having a sense for whether available
The whole
it's available.
tasking, constellation
It,
tasking thing that's all the rage these
exactly.
days. Yeah.
Right, the tasking piece. And the tasking piece really varies. I mean, there's two pieces, right? There's the what's possible and how is it expressed, right? So some providers like it's not even possible to like get a sense for when there's the next available pass and like order that pass via from a technical perspective. Maybe that's possible if you pick up the phone and say, "Hey, I've got this area. I just sent it to you. When can we next pass it?" Maybe that's possible. We're talking about from an interface perspective, right? So some providers don't make that possible. And then from an interface perspective, it's just about like, can we, if the provider or if that reseller wants to be able to expose this capability for their end customer, how do we as a software developer make that possible, right? So the short answer is we haven't had that case yet. The long answer is, we're building software so we can make that happen, right? It's what our approach is very much how can we configure the ordering platform? How can we take something out of the box that does 80-90% of what you need to do,
Yeah.
and then fill up that last 10% based off of your personal needs as a business, your personal needs as a reseller, your personal needs as a satellite operator.
Yeah, okay. I think we've fashioned a segue there to the last item. So to continue another thread across a few episodes, I've been trying on the podcast to keep up with the industry's response to the fires in LA. And the last guest we had on this topic was Kevin Bullock from Development Seed, mainly because he came up on LinkedIn for me, speaking of content generation, basically asking a bunch of people across the industry for their free satellite data or references to that or apps that have been built on it. And he spent a week cataloging all of that, including, importantly, the IP constraints or the usage constraints in a Google Sheet. And basically, his point is that billions is spent launching spectacularly on rockets, all of these Earth observation constellations, but the 1% of that hasn't been spent developing a decent platform that can respond promptly with easy to use imagery during an emergency. So I think we've got a good guest here in you to carry that conversation on if you had any reflections.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, I think that the thought is exactly, what everyone probably wants, right? In these scenarios where, there's some kind of disaster, or also when the Ukraine war came out and started, there was a lot of requests for free data, especially from a geospatial perspective, can be really valuable, for nonprofits and from an aid perspective. So I think the thought is absolutely on point and share it in the sense like, hey, why isn't this available? I think, my initial response to it is often, when you go one step deeper is, why isn't this possible and how would it actually be executed is where you find a lot of kind of the challenges with why, something like this doesn't exist, right? So I think the first point that's relevant, having worked at a marketplace in the past and having had requests for free data in the past, is that as in what marketplaces are is they're resellers, right? So they're not owners of the IP. They're very much subject to a lot of the end user license agreement. Well, sorry, they're not they are very much subject to the license agreements of the supplier. So the supplier essentially still dictates who can access their data at what costs and how, right? So every kind of request, I mean, these kind of intermediary entities have realistically no power in deciding whether or not they can give out data for free, right? They could do it if they took a zero margin, right? And they just said, hey, we'll pay for it and you get it. But
I
as
got
you
you.
can understand, that wouldn't make any sense. And
That's a
so,
donation. Yeah.
right, exactly, right. So that's number one. The second piece is, so why isn't it possible right now? Why can't an existing marketplace do that? Well, that's kind of the constraint, right? So that's why it becomes this kind of inefficient. Like you reach out to a bunch of the kind of they call it like they're like the foundation arms, right? So when you ask for Airbus data, in this case, you reach out to their foundation and they have a certain money allocated
Oh,
that will then
okay.
pay Airbus for that data and then deliver it to the customer, which is in these cases extremely inefficient, right? You go through an email, they figure out who you are, they figure out whether you deserve it, they figure out how much money they can give you, then they buy. It's too late, right? It's
So,
it's
so
not it's not
you're
easy,
saying
right?
there's a humanitarian arm of Airbus?
Yeah. So I mean,
Kinda. Or so some guy sitting at a desk.
yeah, I mean, my like, so I'm not gonna act like I know this for sure, but just my experience was like when we got asked for data in the past for free when I was at Up 42, the my Airbus colleague would say, hey, forward it to the Airbus Foundation. That's kind of
Okay, that's
their
really nice
like
to know, though.
um
Yeah.
right, but I mean that's still the problem that Kevin's describing, right? Which is that, hey, I need to go through all of these different air like
It's
places. They
not
all
like
have
there's a
different
broad
rules.
activate industry-wide activation and everybody knows to click the button to release that image on that platform.
Right,
Okay, you
exactly.
have
And
to
then
still
and
make the
then
call.
yeah, I mean, and then there's also like, there's like a lot of, I mean, a big part of the problem is like the compliance element, right? Like you have to validate, who's getting the imagery, especially if it's SAR and especially if it's over sensitive areas, right? So the fires, no one's probably going to be using that data nefariously. But in wartime, you want to make sure that the right parties are getting that the imagery there, right?
Right,
So
and there could be humanitarian disasters in war zones. So, okay, I understand. So,
correct.
so something that has been mentioned by Dan Schroeder and also Kevin was this International Charter Space and Major Disasters. It's a bit of an awkward sounding title.
Hmm.
But the likes of ISI, I presume Thales and Airbus, the usual suspects in terms of imagery providers, are all listed on the website for that as having signed up. So there is some sort of agreement, but it's kind of funny to observe how um, obviously it's a wonderful, it's the right kind of gesture that should come out of this group of companies. But then you can see the list of activations, and Kevin was pointing out that the LA fires weren't, the charter wasn't activated for those. Yet, a lot of those imagery providers, including aerial imagery ones like Vexel, release data for free. So it's interesting where there's this big, impressive sounding international charter, but in the end, there's still emails and phone calls to actually get the data that's released as part of it. The logical step of a shared platform, hasn't happened. So I have like, what's the cost actually of buying your software to if it was to be used for this to solve this?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, the standard price for our just front end order interface is $25,000 a year. I mean, we'd happily have a discussion for with
Yeah,
a nonprofit entity or a larger entity in terms of
yeah.
establishing such
Again,
a.
versus hundreds of millions per month probably globally spent on launching these satellites. So it's such a huge contrast.
Yeah, so I mean, look, we'd be happy to offer the kind of, front end and the software for to allow these kind of organizations to easily
Yeah,
request free data. We'd be happy to be a contributor to that cause. I
yeah,
think the entity the biggest problem is who is the entity and how do they
yeah,
that kind of manages that
yeah.
and executes on that, right?
I'm
Because
assuming there's like
um,
10 people as an organization with maybe ten staff members full time. I don't know, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, like, my biggest problem is I guess my biggest question is, what is the business model, right? Are they
Yeah,
government funded? Are they like, how do they make money, right? Do the suppliers themselves commit a certain percentage to this
right.
as an act as essentially a nonprofit donation, and it's a nonprofit entity that distributes free data and manages imagery requests from nonprofits, right? Like, I mean, that's an interesting idea. It's just, who wants to do it, who wants to take on that
Okay.
cause, and is it sustainable, and who funds it, right? I mean,
Yeah,
I think I just want to add one kind of last thing, and one thing I really harp on, which is that um, ordering imagery as is in just remote sensing is unfortunately inherently complicated, right? It's not that simple. And that's why you have these compliance pieces, you have different kind of processing levels, you have different data types, you have different suppliers that handle things in different ways. There's a lot of differences, and there's also a lot of confusion, and there's a very big varying level of education around it, right? So, one person may know a lot about how to use the data, another person may not, right? And so you often interactions are at this, where there's like a big gap between knowledge and also a big gap between the specifics of a certain data set, right? And a certain request. And so I think what I'm trying to ultimately say is that it's there's a lot of simplifications that seem, very obvious, that when you dive a little deeper or just try a little harder or have a little more experience in terms of, why like being a part of those transactions, you figure out very quickly why certain things are a certain way, and what specific, very in most cases incremental steps can be made to make things better. But it's
yeah,
very rarely these monumental shifts in, how things are done. And I guess that opportunity is often determined on the supplier side.
yeah. So it's there's a provocative question that I think needs to be asked here. So what happened with the LA fires was that a lot of very, very rich, famous people lost their homes. And suddenly, and look, I don't want to, I confess that I'm asking a provocative question. I'll just push through. I don't mean any I don't have any ill will in asking the question, but it has to be asked. So have we seen such an incredible response? And it has been wonderful what everybody has volunteered to do, but partly because it is the rich, famous, and the powerful that have been affected.
I mean, I think that's very hard to measure to a certain degree, right? I mean, I think there is, from what I remember, um, there was a pretty big response for the floods in New Orleans that happened many years
Sure.
ago.
Yeah.
There are a
That was
lot
an
of
international awareness event. Yeah.
Right, right. I mean, there's a lot of events that happen globally, and I mean, you can absolutely easily say that, certain responses get a lot more airtime, and certain people are a lot more vocal about it. It's just hard for me in my
Mm.
position here to be able to make a comment and say like, hey, it's because it's the rich and famous, that like I can't easily say compare what that the response looks like from a numbers perspective,
Yeah, I
and
really
then
don't mean it to be a snide sort of class-based remark. I guess what I was wondering is if even in outer space where we've got all these highly technical Earth observation platforms, if even there is a class effect, or despite our best intentions, we do still end up serving the powerful. But then even if there is extra airtime uh, because of who's been affected. I feel like there's a chance still for all of humanity to somehow benefit if the result is that these kind of conversations happen. And we do realize that it might actually be cheap and easy to set up a general purpose humanitarian response, Earth observation, checkout, marketplace type system.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think, and also like I guess the meta point that you're making is that events drive more interest in Earth observation, right? Which is both a good and a bad thing, right? I mean, you don't want to. I'm trying to think of the best analogy, right? It's very sad that interest in Earth observation, which can offer a lot of value from a monitoring in a preventative use, comes
Sure.
into the spotlight often after events
When
happen,
people are
right?
dying.
Exactly, or just after things that it's hard to say if it was preventable or not, but things that could have been preventable or at least aided with some kind of Earth observation
Okay.
solution
And you're
beforehand,
making the
right?
tragic point that there are all sorts of signals had we been proper, diligent users of the data that these platforms provide. If we'd used it for prevention, then the deaths mightn't have happened, and that's a really important point to make. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's not necessarily exactly the point I'm making.
Oh,
I
sorry.
mean, that's no, I mean, it's in line, right? I think you're totally right. I think I think my point is that Earth observation solutions add value a lot of the times from a monitoring and a preventative case. I can't say exactly for this case or not, but I think what the morbid reality is that bad events will drive more interest in Earth observation, right? So we're like that's not a positive
Welcome
thing,
to the
but
human species.
right. But like for example, the wars in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, these kind of things, sparked a lot more interest in Earth observation, sparked a lot more money in defense spending in general. These fires are going to drive a lot more interest in a lot of the kind of wildfire prevention solutions that are going to come up, and that's unfortunately a sad thing, right? Because as Earth observation people who work in Earth observation and as in getting down even deeper into the solutions developers of these wildfire solutions, they would hope that interest their solutions can help in the prevention rather than the response to these kind of cases. But I mean that's kind of the human condition to a certain degree, and I think the reality is that these things, as much as we thought for a long period of time, wouldn't happen. Like there's a long period of peace I mean, LA LA had a fire relatively recently, so you could say, and they also had it in NorCal relatively recently as well. So there's a lot of some issues with that one, but more events like this are going to happen around the world, be it hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, fires, and so earthquakes, so on. And Earth observation is set up in a lot of ways to serve these needs from a preventative perspective. And so, yeah, I'm optimistic about the space. I think it's just about figuring out ways that the from a commercial perspective to generate more demand and have the solution be cheaper than the problem, the
Yeah.
potential risk.
Yeah. I think we've got a nice sort of concluding message there. I also appreciated the fact that you mentioned the phrase "the human condition." That's, I guess, what I was trying to get at. That in the end, our human nature still has a strong role to play, even in how these vastly complicated and impressive technical systems that involve rocket launchers work. So yeah, I like that we can cover the full sort of how this all plays out on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I'll raise my hand and say I'm guilty of it, right? I play a good amount of tennis, and I never stretch. And today I played, and I completely hurt my hip, and it was probably preventative if I just stretched, right? And so I learned lessons through this pain, and society as a whole learns lessons through pain, right? And so, if I can make that kind of dumb analogy at the end to close things off.
I love it. I love it. In the end, we're still animals. We're still uh, not too far separated from chimpanzees, but happen to have
Exactly.
satellite constellations at our disposal.
Exactly.
Cool. All right, Leo, I really love the reflections, and also that you were able to put a dollar value on this gap in how we respond to humanitarian disasters via our satellite constellations. So I think you've driven that conversation forward. I'm always searching for more guests to round out this picture here in how this international charter for space and major disasters really does help us. So yeah, thanks, Leo, for that.
Wilfred, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. It was a great conversation, and yeah, thanks for having me.